This is the generator that let me sleep through a freezing blackout without getting up to refuel. This is the box I reach for when I need real 120-240-volt power that starts on the first press and keeps steady under heavy loads. It sits in that sweet spot between small inverters and whole home standby systems. If you're a homeowner who wants reliable backup during storms, an RVer who needs a TT30 shoreline without weird adapters, or a tradesperson who runs saws and compressors on sites without power, it fits that role well. It's not a campground companion, and it's not a permanent replacement for a 50-amp standby, but it covers the big essentials with surprisingly little drama. The design is classic open frame, and what matters day to day is how easy it is to move and run. The fold-down handle gives you enough leverage that one person can roll it across gravel or damp grass without wrestling it. The never-flat tires are firm, but don't bounce around, and the frame feels rigid with clean welds. The control panel is laid out in a way that makes sense when you're cold, wet, or tired. Start controls on the left, a bright digital meter in the middle, and outlets grouped by purpose on the right. You get standard 120-volt household outlets, an RV-ready TT30, and the 120-240-volt L1430 twist lock for a transfer switch. If you need a 50-amp outlet, it's not here, and that matters for big rigs and electric ranges. I also wish the outlets had rubber covers. Dust and dew find their way into uncovered receptacles if you store it in a garage or roll it out on damp mornings. The 6.7-gallon steel tank is sized right for overnight runs, and the fuel gauge is useful when it works. On my unit, the needle stuck once out of the box and freed up after a few hours of vibration, which didn't inspire confidence. The oil fill and drain are accessible without gymnastics, which is great because oil changes on these engines come around quickly. Setup was a simple afternoon. The wheel and handle kit bolts on with the included tools. I added oil, connected the battery lead, and hooked up a propane tank to test both fuels. On propane, the first start took a few extra cranks while the line purged. After that, it fired with a quick press of the electric start. On gasoline, it started immediately. I did the first oil change in around 5 hours, and the oil came out darker than I expected, with a little sparkle in the light. Nothing alarming, just a reminder that the break-in schedule matters. Since then, I've kept a cheap maintenance log, and it's made life easier than guessing. Core performance is where this machine earns its spot. On gasoline, it will handle a refrigerator, a gas furnace blower, lights, a Wi-Fi router, and a sump pump with margin for a microwave cycle without dropping frequency. On propane, it sacrifices a bit of headroom, but the convenience and clean storage are worth it when you don't want to deal with stale fuel. The digital meter sits rock steady at 60 Hz under moderate loads in my tests, and voltage holds tight thanks to AVR. Good enough for motors and appliances. For sensitive electronics, I plug my networking gear and desktop into a UPS and good surge protection, because this is an open frame unit, and the total harmonic distortion isn't marketed as clean. I've had no issues running a pellet stove controller through a line conditioner, but I wouldn't plug expensive audio gear straight into it. Noise is the trade-off. It's lawnmower loud from the next yard over. The rating lands in the mid-70s dB, and that lines up with what my ears tell me. I built a simple L-shaped plywood barrier with ventilation gaps to knock the bark down a bit. It helped, but this isn't for quiet campgrounds. Vibration is controlled enough that it doesn't walk across concrete, though on a wood deck it will resonate. In my house backup tests, I connected the L1430 twist lock to an interlock kit and a transfer switch, then managed loads from the panel. A 3-ton AC condenser with a soft start kicked on without tripping, which surprised me the first time and impressed me the second. The voltage drooped slightly on startup and recovered immediately. In winter, I ran a fridge, furnace fan, a few LED circuits, and my office with a small space heater cycling occasionally. I planned the heater carefully because those draw more than people realize, and I avoided running the microwave at the same time. When feeding the house, I left the front 120-volt outlets empty. Power is shared across all receptacles, and I prefer to keep loads centralized through the panel to avoid surprise trips. On a 72-hour outage in January, I did a hybrid fuel routine. Daytime on propane to avoid storing gas in the cold. Nighttime on gasoline to stretch runtime and avoid a 3 a.m. refill. At around half load, the tank gives a full night without babysitting, which felt like a luxury during a rough storm. The meter's session runtime display was a quiet hero. I knew when to check oil without guessing. On a windless, humid morning, the CO sensor shut the engine down. It was a nuisance, but it also made me reposition the unit farther from a recessed wall where exhaust was pooling. Since then, I keep it well away from corners and under open sky. On the job site, the 120-volt 240-volt selector switch earns its keep. Switch it to 120 only, and the full output is available on the 120-volt side, which kept my 15-amp table saw from bogging and flickering lights when the blade hit wet oak. I wish more generators in this class had that switch because it simplifies how you plan circuits. The RV-ready outlet has been equally straightforward. I plugged a travel trailer directly with a TT30 cable and ran the converter, fridge, and small AC without adapters that get hot. Again, this isn't campground friendly for noise, but for service work and boondocking where volume isn't a concern, it's simple and solid. There are quirks and fixes I've learned along the way. The CO Watchdog is sensitive, which is the point, but it can false trip in certain humidity and wind patterns. I treat that as a setup check rather than a defect. The stock spark plug on mine was a Torch brand, and the engine felt a little rough at idle on gasoline until I swapped in an NGK equivalent. Idle smoothed immediately, and cold starts improved. The included propane hose is short. I replaced it with a longer, better quality line so I could park the tank farther from the muffler. I keep the battery on a trickle charger in long storage because short test runs won't always top it off. I also move it like fragile cargo. Shipping can be hard on open-frame generators, and I've seen friends receive units with bent panels and dented tanks from rough handling. Mine arrived fine, but I inspected it closely before the first start, and I'd suggest doing the same so any warranty claims are cleaned. One of my favorite small details is the meter's total hours and frequency readout. It brings some peace of mind when I'm running induction motors. I also like that the recoil starter is there as backup. I've only needed it once, after leaving the battery disconnected for too long, and it worked on the second pull. The dual fuel setup is the security blanket of this whole package. Propane stores forever, doesn't gum the carb, and lets me do monthly exercise runs without touching gasoline. Gasoline gives me that extra headroom for heavy lift days. Having both means I don't worry about whichever fuel is harder to find during a storm. If your priority is quiet, clean power for laptops and cameras near tents, this isn't the pick. If you need a 50-amp outlet for a large RV, or to run a high-demand 240-volt appliance alongside a lot of other loads, you'll bump into the 30-amp limitation. And if you never want to think about oil changes or load planning, a permanent standby is still the gold standard. For everyone else who wants real wattage, a dependable electric start, straightforward maintenance, and the flexibility to choose between gasoline and propane, this model earns its keep. It has the right outlets for home backup and RV work, the 120-volt only mode for tool-heavy days, and a safety system that can be annoying at times, but ultimately does its job. This is the generator I trust to keep essentials on when the grid goes down and to run tools without drama when the job can't wait. It isn't perfect, but it's honest power with features that matter when you're cold, tired, or on a deadline. If that sounds like your use case, it's worth a serious look. If you found this video helpful, subscribe for more real-world gear reviews and leave a comment with your questions or your own experience with dual fuel generators.